The following, forgotten but very dramatic, true crime story is taken from 5 archived newspapers dating from May 13th, 1925 to July 21st, 1927. Widow avenges death of mate with revolver. Georgian acquitted of murder, shot to death by woman. Statham, Georgia, May 12th. Desperate from 6 months of brooding over the loss of her husband and the fate of Guy Thurman, his slayer, whom the courts acquitted, Mrs. Green Bowman, Tuesday, avenged her husband's death with that of his assailant. Mrs. Bowman confronted Thurman on a street in the heart of the downtown business district. The widow was pale and haggard from long sleepless nights, and her glaring eyes were focused on her husband's slayer. "Where's Dick's pistol?" Mrs. Bowman demanded of Thurman. Her hands were buried in sweater pockets, but no one dreamed what they held. "It's down at Winder," Thurman answered. He turned and started to walk away. "Wait a minute," cried Mrs. Bowman, excited, her drawn face twitching and her hands working uneasily at her sweater pockets. "Guy, you've got that gun, and you know it. Now listen, Guy." But Thurman had kept straight on down the street. "Guy!" Mrs. Bowman called once more, and when he failed to halt, the thin woman seemed to lose control of herself. She became highly excited and glanced about furtively. Lean hands shot out from her sweater pockets and a pistol sounded. Thurman grabbed his side. Again, the pistol barked and another shot took effect. Thurman ran for a store and Mrs. Bowman, wild and excited, followed close behind. Thurman ran into the store, receiving another wound as he crossed the threshold. Immediately, he darted out, crazed from the wounds, only to receive another bullet, this time point blank in his chest. Thurman stumbled against Mrs. Bowman and bowled her over in his mad attempt to escape her avenging bullets. He staggered on a few feet and fell. Bewildered witnesses ran to where Thurman lay. He was dead. Another group gathered about Mrs. Bowman, including police, who had been attracted by the shooting. I did it, Mrs. Bowman screamed. "He killed my husband, and now I've killed him. Dick's been avenged. Take me away." She was taken to the Winder, Georgia jail. Thurman had been acquitted of Bowman's death when the court ruled the killing was justified. Bowman had threatened Thurman's life, the court found. Woman kills slayer of husband. Mrs. G.S. Bowman sends 5 bullets into the body of Guy Thurman, who falls dead at her feet. Statham, Georgia. Mrs. Jetty Bowman, whose husband was shot down last November on the streets here by Guy J. Thurmond, Tuesday morning encountered her husband's assailant in front of the bank of Statham and shot him dead. Mrs. Bowman fired 5 shots into the body of Thurmond before he crumpled in the street, mortally wounded as a dozen or more dazed-eyed witnesses looked on. 5 shots she sent into Thurman's body, some as he raced into his store, some as he raced out again, one as he fell dead at her feet. Then hysterical, weeping, screaming, she was picked up by startled, frightened witnesses and neighbours and taken to Winder to the Barrow County Jail, where she lay moaning at her fate and shrieking in terror. The shooting was filled with drama, as the widow met the man who had killed her own man and gone free. There were few words. There were only moments of tense waiting, a scream, then the relentless spitting of bullets, and a dying gasp. Mrs. Bowman met Thurmond in front of the Bank of Statham at 9 o'clock Tuesday morning. At that hour, most of the inhabitants of Statham were at the railroad station to watch the incoming train from Atlanta and to get the morning's batch of mail. The widow, clutching at her sweater with trembling hands, stopped in front of Thurmond. "Where's my husband's pistol?" she asked in a tone that was hollow and unreal. Thurmond smiled. "I don't know," he said. "I suppose the sheriff has it. Why don't you ask him where it is?" "I know better than that," Mrs. Bowman replied. With that, she drew a pistol from beneath her sweater, where it had been concealed. She pointed the weapon squarely at Thurmond and pulled the trigger. Thurmond turned and fled for the store of H.E. Bedingfield. The woman leaped out in pursuit, grimly determined, while behind her, the dumbfounded witnesses looked on helplessly before the unfolding tragedy. At the doorway of the store, Mrs. Bowman fired 3 times more, 3 times after 2 shots already had been sent by her hand into his breast. The 3 shots reached Thurman's back and arms. He turned from the store again and ran into the street. In front of the bank, he sank to the ground, dead. As he came out of the store, the widow of the man he had shot fired her last bullet at him. but it went wild. Instead of finding a human target, it crashed through the window of the Bank of Statham, where J.A. Pope, a bank examiner, was at work, and embedded itself in the wall a few feet from his head. The shooting ended 6 months brooding over the slaying of Bowman, a slaying for which Thurmond was freed and held justified in committing. It was last November that the first shooting occurred. There was a quarrel, which grew bitterer as the weeks passed, and the two men were known to have been at outs. Then came a day of a more violent quarrel in a livery stable, and the flourishing, according to the police, of a weapon by Bowman. Thurmond, they said, secured a pistol, and when he used it, Bowman lay dead at his feet. Thurmond was never placed in jail. He was tried and freed. The killing was declared to have been justifiable, and the matter, so far as the courts were concerned, was at an end. Not so for the woman who was left to mourn alone for her husband. She brooded over the shooting. She remembered that day when her husband was shot. Bowman had fired at Thurmond, but the bullets had gone wild, and she had gone to lead her husband home. She was with him when they again met Thurmond, and she was with him when he sank to the sidewalk with a bullet through his heart, and when he died without a word of farewell. Thurmond was one of the wealthiest men in Barrow County, and had married the daughter of another wealthy man of the community. He is survived by his wife and 2 children, Grace 13 and Guy Thurmond Jr. 9. Mrs. Bowman has 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Mrs. Bowman is in the Barrow County Jail, having been taken there by Chief of Police Sam Wall and her brother, D.T. Hammond, immediately after the shooting. No preliminary trial date has been set, and nothing will be done, it was indicated, until the woman recovers from the hysteria into which the tragedy threw her. Sanity to be tested. Alienist will examine woman who slew to avenge husband. Winder, Georgia, May 29. On the word of an expert alienist will rest the fate of Mrs. Maynard Bowman, who a few weeks ago shot and killed Guy Thurman to avenge the death of her husband, Green Bowman. Judge W. W. Stark, Friday, authorised the employment of an expert alienist to test Mrs. Bowman's sanity. If the alienist pronounces the woman avenger sane, she will be tried for murder, Judge Stark said. An insanity verdict will place her in a sanitarium. Mrs. Bowman is in a Winder hospital, weak from frequent fits of apparent delirium. She killed Thurman 6 months after he had shot and killed her husband, following an argument. Thurman had been acquitted by a court ruling, which held Bowman's killing had been justified. Insanity verdict for Mrs. Bowman. Winder. Mrs. Maynard Bowman, held in Barrow County Hospital following the killing by her of Guy Thurman on the streets of Statham a few weeks ago, has been declared insane in a hearing before Ordinary Parker. Application has been made to the authorities of the insane asylum at Milledgeville, and as soon as arrangements are made, she will be sent there, subject to orders from Judge W. W. Stark, based on the outcome of her case. Jury absolves Mrs. Bowman. Winder, Georgia, July 18th. The Barrow County Grand Jury in session here today, after investigating the sanity of Mrs. Maynard Bowman at the time she shot and killed Guy Thurman on the streets of Statham on May 12, 1925. Also, the charges of murder brought against her by the father of the slain man returned a no bill, which automatically frees her. E.A. Starr was foreman, and J.H. Maynard clerk of the jury, and practically the whole day's session was spent hearing witnesses in the Bowman case. Judge W. W. Stark is presiding at the July term of Barrow Superior Court, and Solicitor Pemberton Cooley is representing the state. Mrs. Bowman shot Thurmond, a prominent Barrow County citizen, 5 times on the main street of Statham, killing him almost instantly. It was stated at the time that she was mentally unbalanced and highly incensed against Thurmond, who had killed her husband, Dick Bowman, at Statham about a year before and was acquitted. Taking a neighbour's pistol and going into Statham, she met Thurmond near the bank and shot him 5 times, any one of which would have been fatal, it was said. A lunacy writ was taken for Mrs. Bowman by her brothers, D.T. and Frank Hammond, and at the same time, J. W. Thurmond, the slain man's father, swore out a warrant charging her with the murder of his son. Mrs. Bowman was placed in the state sanitarium at Milledgeville, and recently she was released from the institution. the superintendent notifying Judge Stark that her physical condition was sufficiently improved to warrant her release. She was taken into custody by officers awaiting today's hearing by the jury. I stumbled upon that story entirely by accident while researching other videos. So if you're also interested in more forgotten stories from history, such as this one, and deep dives into the historical archives, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.